Good day. The title of my lecture is How I Changed My Mind on Israel. Once upon a time, I was a supersessionist. Now, actually, I held to this way of thinking about Jewish Israel for much of my self-consciously theological life. Now, what do I mean by supersessionist? Let me explain the faith of the supersessionist. It means believing that the Gentile church has superseded Jewish Israel in God's affections. A corollary to this is the conception that the Old Testament is all about the particular and the New Testament is all about the universal. The Old Testament God cares only about a little people called the Jews and a little land called Israel. But the New Testament God in Jesus cares about the whole world, not only its people, but also all of its lands. And after Jesus, God stopped worrying, as it were, about the Jews and their little land the size of New Jersey. Now he has the whole world in his hands and all the Gentiles. To think that he has a special care for Jews is to attribute favoritism to God. Yet Peter says that God repudiated such favoritism when the apostle declared that God shows no partiality, Acts 10. Now, supersessionists believe that God did indeed covenant with Israel way back at the beginning with Abraham. But they also believe that when most of Jewish Israel failed to embrace their Messiah in Jesus, that God transferred the covenant to the Gentile church, which then became the new Israel. They find support for this transfer of the covenant in Jesus' parable of the wicked tenants in Matthew 21. Jesus suggested, they say, that the tenants who beat, stoned, and killed the servants, and then the son of the vineyard owner, were the Jews who killed the prophets and were about to kill Jesus. When Jesus said the owner would let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons, he meant the Gentiles. God, they say, was through with the Jews. That this parable proves that Jesus believed that God was through with the Jews and was starting over with the Gentiles who accepted him as Messiah. These Gentiles, who in succeeding generations came to populate the church in great numbers, were the new owners of the covenant. Therefore, the supersessionist story goes, the true Israel is no longer Jewish Israel, but the church, which has accepted Jesus, made up of Gentiles and Jews alike. But although Jews are a small minority within this church, they do not follow Jesus in a particularly Jewish way. Jesus and Paul, they say, abolished distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. Jewish law has been transcended by the new law of Christ, 1 Corinthians 9. Jews outside this church are of no particular interest to God anymore, and the land of Israel is of no more significance than the land of New Jersey, about the same size. Now, I believed all this for the first 2.5 decades of my adult Christian years. But then I had a wake-up call. It came in the form of gentle questions from a tour guide in Israel who was helping me lead a group of church people on a pilgrimage there. When I taught the group at biblical sites, I larded my comments with the supersessionist narrative I just described. My guide, Baruch Kavaznika, posed polite questions to me after most of my lectures privately. He made me want to learn why he was asking these questions. So I hunted down the books and articles which he suggested. They pointed me to many more. And after several years of following up these leads, I began to realize that I had missed much of the Jewish reality of both testaments because I'd been trained to miss it. I thought of the book I'd read as an undergrad at the University of Chicago that had made such a deep impression on me, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1961. Kuhn showed that established scientists repeatedly refused to accept clear evidence right in front of their eyes for the new scientific breakthroughs because they could not see that evidence, despite the fact that it was staring at them in the face. Their training in the existing scientific paradigm had blinded them to data that contradicted their training. They had eyes but could not see, as Jesus might put it. One day it dawned on me that the same thing had happened to me. I had read the Bible carefully, I thought, for 25 years, but missed what was right in front of my eyes. And I missed it because I'd been told in my training that it wasn't there. The passage that suddenly jumped off the page was Romans 11:28 and 29. Paul said the Jews who had not accepted Jesus were still beloved to God for the sake of their forefathers. Their calling of God, which was to be a light to the nations, that's Isaiah 42 and 49, and a blessing to all the families of the earth, Genesis 12, was irrevocable, could not be revoked. So in other words, Jewish Israel's calling by God to be the apple of his eye, Zechariah 2, in a way that no other people would never be revoked. It was still in place, even if the majority of Jewish Israel was still failing to recognize its Messiah. Now, it's significant that Paul was writing this toward the end of his career. In the epistle, Romans, that was his most mature reflection on the meaning of Jewish Israel. Later, I came to see that the church is never called the New Israel in the New Testament. The word Israel is used 77 times in the New Testament. In every instance, it refers to the Jewish people, or the Jewish polity, or the land itself. But many say, but what about Galatians 6:16? I'll read it to you. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them, and upon the Israel of God. This verse is commonly interpreted as a clear reference to a Gentile or a mixed Gentile-Jewish church that is called by Paul the Israel of God. Thus, the church is the new Israel. Does this not suggest that here is a church with Gentiles that's called Israel? Well, there are problems with this interpretation. It misses the contrast that Paul draws within the verse between two types of people. The first type is all who walk by this rule. Well, what's the rule? Paul tells us in the preceding verse. Neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. Those who walk by this rule are all those who embrace the new creation in Jesus the Messiah, the Christ. Paul blesses them. Peace and mercy be upon them. Now, it's probable that the vast majority of the church in Galatians, or maybe even the entirety, was Gentile. So Paul here is talking about, since he's addressing this to the church of Galatia, Gentiles who know the new creation and who walk in the new creation. But the traditional supersessionist interpretation of this verse misses the import of the words Paul uses to close this verse. And upon the Israel of God. That is, the Jews who do accept Jesus as Messiah. Now, there's another possible interpretation that Paul uses a traditional Jewish blessing for the purpose of blessing both the church and also Messianic Israel outside the church or within the church. That is, Galatians 6:16 may be a shortened form of the end of the Amidah, the Jewish prayer which Jews have prayed 3 times a day for thousands of years. Rabbis often shorten it, and they did back then, in a manner similar to the way Paul does in this verse. The longer form of the ending is as follows. Grant peace, goodness and blessing, grace and kindness and mercy upon us and upon all Israel, your people. So you see, the words of the traditional ending of the Amidah are repeated almost verbatim in Paul's blessing at the end of Galatians 6:16. If Paul is indeed using a shortened form of the Amidah blessing, which is entirely plausible, it's all the more clear that Paul's phrase, Israel of God, refers to the same people that the Amidah calls Israel your people, Jews, and probably here Messianic Jews, who also recognize the new creation. Thus, by both of these readings, one using the literary context and the other considering the Amidah, the Israel of God refers not to a mixed Gentile Jewish church called Israel, but to Gentiles who recognize the new creation and Messianic Jews who recognize their Messiah. Now, about this same time, more than 20 years ago, a familiar passage in the Sermon on the Mount took on new clarity for me. Jesus admonished his disciples not to think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets, Matthew 5:17a. Now, I remember thinking about this time that the traditional interpretation of Jesus vis-a-vis Israel was that he had come to do precisely that, to abolish the law and the prophets, because he'd come to start a new religion called Christianity that was a radical break from the law and the prophets of first century Judaism. But Jesus insisted here, Matthew 5:17, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. He went on to say that until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, that's the smallest letter of the Greek alphabet, as most of you know, nor a horn. Now the Greek word here, horn, chorion, refers to the smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew. Not an iota nor a horn will pass away until all is accomplished. When I realized that Jesus' Bible was the Old Testament, it became clear that Jesus was referring to Torah, most certainly, and possibly to the rest of the Old Testament as well. I had always thought that only the moral part of Old Testament law had any significance for Christians. But now it seemed that Jesus was speaking of every part of Torah, what we call the Pentateuch, and not just his moral commandments. Now, I wasn't sure how those other parts could apply to the Christian life, but it now seemed clear. It now seemed clear that Jesus was far more closely connected to the Judaism of his day than I had previously imagined. Before this wake-up call, I had taken Jesus' vitriolic denunciations of the Pharisees in Matthew 23 as a sign of Jesus' break with Judaism. But then I began to read more widely and to see that a rising number of scholars were distinguishing between different schools of Pharisees. Not all Pharisees were alike. Some, like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, were attracted to Jesus and sought to protect him. You see that in Luke 13:31. While others disliked the corrupt temple leadership just as Jesus did, but were wary of Jesus. Long after he had started following Jesus, Paul said, I am a Pharisee, Acts 23:6. He did not distance himself from Pharisaic beliefs. Now, I was shocked to see one day that Jesus did not distance himself from Pharisaic beliefs either. At the beginning of his diatribe against Pharisaic practice in Matthew 23, he startlingly used not one but two verbs to urge his followers to follow Pharisaic teachings. Now, as we all know, he warned them not to do what they do, for they preach but do not practice. That's 23:3b. But just before that, in 23:3a, he exhorted his followers, Jesus told his followers to practice, poiesata, and protect, tereta, whatever they tell you. Whoa. And now he was probably quoting here Deuteronomy 4:6. Do and protect, as it is in the Septuagint. Very similar Greek verbs. Now, I was standing on the remains of the 3rd century synagogue at Capernaum near the beautiful shore of the Sea of Galilee when Baruch first showed me this verse, which I had seen hundreds of times over the years, but had never noticed the second half of verse 3. I couldn't believe my eyes, or more truthfully, I wondered how I could have missed this for decades. Now, after this discovery, the wicked tenants parable looked very different. I began to see that the messengers whom the wicked tenants beat and killed were Jewish prophets. And the new tenants who would replace the wicked tenants were not Gentiles, but the Jewish apostles, whom Jesus was raising up to reconstitute the 12 tribes of Israel. So God, I started to realize, was not done with Jewish Israel. Even though most of them had not come on board the new Messianic project. There were still tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands who did, according to historians. And we know there were at least tens of thousands in Jerusalem alone, according to Matthew 21, Acts 21, excuse me. But God's covenant with them was still in place. He still loves them in a special way. God's hand is still on them. And we Gentile Christians would do well to realize that and stop claiming that we are the new Israel for a God who has rejected non-Messianic Israel. Now, there's one last piece of this which I will mention. God's original covenant with Abraham contained two promises. He would give Abraham two gifts, sons and a land. Promise of these two gifts, progeny and a land, is repeated hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the promise of the land is repeated explicitly or implicitly 1,000 times in those scriptures. And I have documented this in two of my books, The New Christian Zionism and Israel Matters. The gift of the land also shows up in the New Testament, despite claims to the contrary by countless Christian scholars. Where? Well, all over, right on the surface of the text. But again, as for the continuation of God's covenant with the Jewish people, we have not seen it because we've been taught not to see it. Jesus, for example, predicted that Jerusalem would continue to be trampled upon by the Gentiles until the end of the times of the Gentiles. Well, when was that? Well, we are right now in the midst of the end of the times of the Gentiles. For after 2,000 years, Jerusalem ceased to be trampled upon, that means controlled by the Gentiles, in 1967, when Israeli paratroopers captured East Jerusalem, restoring control of all Jerusalem to the Jews for the first time since Pompey's troops captured Jerusalem in 63 BC. So exactly 2,030 years later, or roughly 1,930 years after Jesus' prediction. Notice that Jesus was referring to the future of Jerusalem in the land of Israel, clearly implying that God still had and has plans for the land of Israel, which continue into our day. Jesus also predicted that one day the people of Jerusalem will welcome him when they say to him, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." It's Matthew 23:39 and Luke 13:35. What about Paul? Well, he too believed the land promise. He states it clearly in his speech at the synagogue in Antioch, Pisidia, modern-day Turkey, in Acts chapter 13, starting at the end of verse 16. "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen," he told the Jews and the God-fearers there. "The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt, and with uplifted arm he led them out of it. And for about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance." What about Peter? In his second speech in Jerusalem, he talks about a future time for restoration, or apokatastasis, that's the Greek word that's used, that is still yet to come. It's still to come. This was the word used in the Septuagint, which was the Bible for the early church, for the future return of Jews from all over the world back to the land. Now, many scholars think that return took place after the Babylonian captivity. But Peter says here, more than 500 years after the return from the Babylonian captivity, that the return has not happened yet. This apokatastasis has not taken place. It's still in the future. And Peter's speaking after the resurrection of Christ. There's still something to come in the future, he says, this apokatastasis, this return of Jews from all over the world to the land. So when did Jews return from all the 4 corners of the world to the land of Israel? The 18th through the 20th centuries. Never before in the previous 2,000 years was there such a worldwide return of Jews back to the land of Israel. This return seems to be the apokatastasis to which Peter referred. And by the way, when Jeremiah and Ezekiel used this word for future return, they both said the Jews would return before they would experience full spiritual return, or conversion. So we need not worry that not all Israeli Jews are religious, or that still only a tiny percentage has seen the beauty of Jesus as Messiah. The Bible has already seen its prophecy of worldwide return fulfilled. Now it remains for what Paul prophesied in Romans 11, when all Israel will be saved. This is the next step in the gradual series of steps of fulfillment of the biblical prophecies about the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, friends, brothers and sisters, if you've not had the conversion of mind which has come upon me in the last 25 years, please let the Spirit and the Word of God open your mind and heart to this beautiful dimension of the gospel and Jesus and the early church and the land of Israel. God chose the Jews as his chosen people. He chose to incarnate himself in a Jewish man, and all the early apostles were Jews, and arguably every writer of the New Testament was a Jew. God continues to work on this planet through the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And as the modern prophet Yogi Berra famously said, "It ain't over till it's over. The best is yet to come." Thank you.